Have you ever blamed yourself for something you had no power to control? Claire Donovan's hands wrapped around the steering wheel with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times before. Route 47, Pittsburgh, morning shift. The same passengers boarding at the same stops, the same rhythm of air brakes and automatic doors, the same practiced smile she wore like a uniform. At 42, Claire had become what everyone called reliable, the driver who never called in sick, who knew passengers by name, who stayed an extra shift when someone needed coverage. But what looked like dedication from the outside was something else entirely from within. It was penance. Every single day, as she checked her mirrors and released the brake, Claire was actually doing something invisible, trying to rewrite a moment from 15 years ago, a moment in a shopping mall parking lot, a moment when she had refused to drive her younger sister home because they'd argued about Emily's toxic boyfriend, a moment when 19-year-old Emily, proud and stubborn, had slammed the car door and said she'd find her own way back, and a moment, hours later, when Emily had gotten into a car with a drunk friend. The car had flipped on a wet highway, and her sister had died before reaching the hospital. No one had ever blamed Claire out loud. The family spoke of destiny, of bad luck, of the driver's recklessness. But inside her own mind, Claire had carved a sentence into stone that she'd never spoken aloud to anyone. If I had swallowed my pride and driven her home, she would still be alive. That belief became the engine that ran her entire existence. She chose a job where she spent every day safely transporting people from one place to another, as if she were perpetually trying to complete the journey she hadn't made that night. She raised her 16-year-old daughter, Zoe, with suffocating overprotection, demanding real-time location updates, vetting friendships, panicking if a phone call went to the third ring without an answer. She refused social invitations, avoided romantic relationships, never took vacations, terrified that letting her guard down for even a moment might create another opening for tragedy. The guilt was invisible to everyone else, but it shaped every decision. And as the years accumulated, her mind grew exhausted. Claire struggled to sleep, reliving the parking lot scene in photographic detail. Every time she saw a young female passenger sitting alone in the back of the bus, scrolling through her phone, Claire's chest would tighten, as if every face contained a version of Emily she needed to somehow save. The catalyst arrived disguised as bureaucracy. The transit company where Claire worked experienced a string of small incidents over several weeks. A passenger fainting, an elderly woman tripping on the stairs, a teenager nearly getting hit by a car when exiting at the wrong stop. Nothing serious, but enough for management to implement a mandatory emotional support program for drivers. Monthly group sessions led by a contracted psychologist, Dr. Simone Hart. Claire hated the idea immediately. It felt like a waste of time, like stirring up the past, like therapy masquerading as professional development. She preferred to just keep functioning, keep moving, keep the guilt machine running smoothly. But attendance wasn't optional. At the first session, held in a dreary conference room that smelled of burnt coffee, Claire sat with her arms crossed, silent, listening to colleagues talk about job stress, fear of robberies, frustrating traffic. Dr. Simone Hart, a woman in her 50s with calm eyes and a voice that didn't try too hard, noticed something heavier sitting in Claire's silence. But she didn't push. Not yet. Meanwhile, at home, the tension escalated. Zoe received an invitation to travel with her school volleyball team to a tournament in another city. 3 days, hotel stay, supervised by coaches. Any other mother would have seen it as an opportunity. For Claire, it was a direct trigger. She said no, without thinking, inventing reasons about safety and money. Zoe exploded in a way she never had before. You act like the world is going to collapse if I take one step alone. What did you do that was so terrible that you think everything is your fault? The words cut through Claire's chest like a surgical blade because they touched exactly the hidden wound. The feeling that she had done something terrible and would never pay enough for it. She didn't answer. She just sent her daughter to her room, closed the kitchen door, and stood trembling alone against the sink. Days later, at the second group session, Dr. Simone introduced a simple exercise. She asked each driver to say one phrase they typically repeated to themselves when something went wrong. One said, "I knew this would be a problem." Another, "Nothing is ever easy for me." When it was Claire's turn, she released it almost without thinking, as if the words had been waiting for permission. "I always think it's my fault." The room fell silent for a second. It wasn't a dramatic confession, just a truth tossed into the air. And that's when the pivotal moment arrived, the exact point the title promised. Dr. Simone didn't say it's not your fault, didn't minimize, didn't correct. She simply asked, with a calm, direct, almost clinical voice, "Why?" Not "what happened?" Not "what are you talking about?" Just "why?" And then she added, with gentle firmness, "Why exactly do you believe that almost everything is your fault?" Claire tried to escape with generalities. "Because I always make bad decisions. Because I should know things beforehand. Because that's just how I am." But Dr. Simone kept asking the same question, like a symbolic method. "Why? And why is that your responsibility? If someone else had done the same thing, would you tell them it was their fault?" That gentle bombardment of whys began dismantling the rigid narrative Claire had constructed. For the first time in years, she started crying in front of other people. She told the story in pieces: the argument, the parking lot, the choice not to drive Emily home, the friend's car, the hospital. She expected judgment, but no one looked horrified. Some colleagues lowered their heads. Others recognized themselves in the weight of old decisions. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Dr. Simone didn't treat Claire like a broken person who needed fixing. She treated her like someone carrying a burden that didn't actually belong to her, and who had simply never been given permission to set it down and examine it closely. The human mind, Dr. Simone explained during a private follow-up session Claire had reluctantly agreed to, is remarkable at creating narratives that give us a sense of control. Even false control is less frightening than chaos. If you tell yourself, "It was my fault," then you're also telling yourself, "I could have prevented it," and that feels safer than admitting that life is sometimes random and cruel and completely outside our power. Claire had never thought of it that way. Her guilt had always felt like truth, not like a story. But Dr. Simone continued, "You've been asking yourself the wrong question for 15 years. You keep asking, 'Why didn't I save her?' But the real question you need to ask is, 'Why do I believe I had the power to save her in the first place?'" The distinction felt like a key turning in a lock Claire didn't know existed. Dr. Simone then introduced a method that was simple, visual, and repeatable, something Claire could use long after the sessions ended. She called it redistribution of responsibility. "Every time you catch yourself saying, 'It's my fault,'" Dr. Simone said, pulling out a blank piece of paper and drawing 3 columns, "I want you to write down, mentally or literally, 3 categories." She labeled them. What was actually under my control? What was under someone else's control? What was under no one's control? "You don't have to show this to anyone," she said. "It's a private exercise, but it forces your mind to distinguish between responsibility and omnipotence." Claire resisted at first. The exercise felt too simple, too neat, like it was minimizing the gravity of what had happened. But Dr. Simone gave her homework. Write about that night 15 years ago using the 3-column method. Alone at her kitchen table after Zoe had gone to bed, Claire pulled out a notebook. She stared at the blank page for 20 minutes before finally writing. What was actually under my control? I could have swallowed my pride. I could have driven Emily home despite the argument. I could have insisted more strongly that she shouldn't go with the friend. Claire's hand shook as she wrote. This was the list she had memorized, the list that had become her prison. But then Dr. Simone's voice echoed in her mind. Now write the second column. What was under Emily's control or someone else's? What was under someone else's control? Emily chose to leave the car. Emily chose to accept a ride from a friend. The friend chose to drive drunk. The friend chose the route. The friend failed to control the vehicle. Claire's pen slowed. She had never actually written this down. Never allowed herself to see that between her decision and Emily's death stood a whole chain of other people's choices. Then came the hardest column. What was under no one's control? The rain that made the road slippery. The exact timing of the car's trajectory. The physics of the crash. The distance to the hospital. The severity of Emily's injuries. By the time Claire finished, tears were falling onto the paper, smudging the ink. But something was different. The tears weren't just grief anymore. They were something closer to release. She looked at the 3 columns and realized that the first column, the one she'd been obsessing over for 15 years, was the smallest one. Over the next several weeks, Claire practiced the method religiously. When a passenger got off at the wrong stop and had to walk an extra block, her first thought was, I should have reminded them. But then she asked, why is that my responsibility? And she filled in the invisible columns. When Zoe got a B on a test, and Claire's mind immediately went to, I should have checked her homework more, she stopped and asked, why? And realized Zoe was 16, not 6. The method wasn't about erasing responsibility. It was about right-sizing it. About learning to distinguish between what she genuinely could have controlled and what her exhausted mind had inflated into a life sentence. The emotional climax came during a particularly raw session when Dr. Simone asked Claire to describe, in forensic detail, what was and wasn't under her control on that specific night 15 years ago. She guided her with concrete questions. Did you know the friend was drunk? No. Did you force Emily to get into his car? No. Could you have predicted the exact moment of the accident? No. If you had driven Emily home that night and she had died in a different accident the next week, would you still be blaming yourself? That last question landed like a thunderbolt. Claire opened her mouth to answer and realized, yes, I probably would. Exactly, Dr. Simone said quietly, because this isn't really about logic. It's about the story you needed to tell yourself to survive something unbearable. You turned yourself into the villain of your own life because being the villain meant you had power. And having power, even imaginary power, is less terrifying than accepting that sometimes terrible things happen and no one is in control. Claire sat in that truth for a long moment. And then she asked, her voice barely a whisper, so what do I do now? Dr. Simone leaned forward. You forgive the 27-year-old woman who made a choice during an argument. You acknowledge that she was human, that she was angry, that she couldn't see the future. And then you stop punishing the 42-year-old woman who has been paying for a debt that was never actually hers to pay. The transformation wasn't sudden or magical. Claire didn't stop missing Emily. She didn't wake up one morning cured. But something fundamental had shifted. The guilt was no longer the only lens through which she saw the world. One evening, about 2 months after the sessions began, Claire sat down with Zoe in the living room. For the first time, she told her daughter the full story of her Aunt Emily, not as a shameful secret, but as a sad fact of family history. She admitted that she'd been afraid to let Zoe have independence because she felt like she had failed once before. Zoe listened in silence. When Claire finished, her daughter said something that completed the circle in a way Claire never expected. So you're not controlling because you think I'm weak. You're controlling because you're scared. Zoe paused. But Mom, I'm not Aunt Emily, and you're not God. That sentence, delivered so simply by a 16-year-old, functioned as a seal of liberation. Claire didn't suddenly become permissive or reckless, but she negotiated the school trip with clear rules. She let Zoe go after years of reflexively saying no. She was anxious, of course. She checked schedules, followed news reports. But this time she didn't paralyze herself or sabotage her daughter. She chose to trust life a little more and her own internal punishment a little less. The final scene of the story returns us to a rainy afternoon, months later. Claire drives her bus through the city, And when she pulls into a parking lot, the same type of parking lot where her greatest tragedy occurred, she opens the door for a young woman rushing to board, backpack bouncing on her shoulders. For a split second, the old guilt tries to resurface. But instead of drowning in it, Claire asks herself mentally, why? And she answers honestly, because I'm afraid. Not because it's true. The passenger sits down. The light changes. The bus moves forward. And for the first time in 15 years, Claire Donovan allows herself to believe that carrying people safely from one place to another might just be her job, not her eternal penance. The question that frees you isn't whose fault was it. It's why do I still believe I had the power to control what I couldn't? Many exhausted minds don't need to hear, it's not your fault. They need someone to gently, honestly ask, why have you been carrying this for so long? Liberation begins when guilt stops being a sentence and becomes a question. This story reminds us that invisible guilt can be the most exhausting burden of all, not because it's real, but because we've never given ourselves permission to ask why. Sometimes liberation doesn't come from hearing, it's not your fault. It comes from finally questioning why we've been carrying something that was never ours to carry. What invisible guilt are you still choosing to carry that you could set down today? If this story touched something deep within you, write the word release in the comments. Share what city you're watching from. Your journey might inspire someone else. Subscribe and hit the bell because every week I share stories that can transform how you see yourself and your struggles. Click the card on screen for another powerful story of transformation. And remember, your freedom might be just one honest question away.